Uh, we will be answering questions at the end of Dave's presentation. I'm so excited that Dave Warner from Calvin University could join us tonight and teach us all about watersheds and native plants and curb cut gardens that help with stormwater drainage. It's a really interesting topic. And no, I'm going to pass off to Norm Shearer, president, who will be introducing Dave.
Hello, everyone. David Warners has taught biology at Calvin University since 1997, working in the areas of plant evolution, field botany, and restoration ecology. Since 2009, Dave has been directing Plaster Creek Stewards, a university-based watershed group focused on restoring health and beauty to the highly urbanized and degraded Plaster Creek watershed. This work involves propagating native plants for community-based restoration projects, as well as ongoing research on stream microbes, macroinvertebrates, flow dynamics, and the relative success of native species in novel urban ecosystems. In 2019, Dave and his colleague, Matthew Kuhn, published an edited volume, Beyond Stewardship, that explores new ways of understanding humanity's place in creation. Actually, it sounds like an interesting subject. This book identifies limitations of the prevailing Christian environmental stewardship model, and in its place offers new approaches to creation care. Dave has served as an environmental consultant and has performed many botanical inventories for local townships, state parks, and conservation organizations. He assists local schools, churches, and parks in establishing native gardens, and also leads local plant rescue efforts. Pretty good resume there. Let's welcome Dave to our webinar. Dave?
Great, thanks a lot, Norm and Sue. It's really nice to be with you guys tonight. Thank you for the invitation to tell you this story about Plaster Creek and our efforts to try to restore some health and beauty back to this watershed once again. Let me pull up my slides. All right, are we looking good?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Thank you, Sue.
Yes.
You're welcome.
All right, Norm, thanks a lot for mentioning that book, Beyond Stewardship. I do want to say I was raised in a Christian community and still work and live in the context of sort of the Reformed flavor of Christianity. And I was sort of steeped in this idea of environmental stewardship. We need to take care of the creation. And I will say that a lot of the work that I've done with the Plaster Creek Stewards effort has really led me to rethink that whole model of environmental stewardship. And I think you'll see some of those maybe fresh thoughts as I go through this presentation. But I hesitate a lot with the idea that the creation is something out there that we need to take care of. It too much separates us from it in my mind. And I think we need to understand much better that we are part of creation. You and I are creation. And what we are called to tend and to care is everything around us, including one another. You know, we're called to take care of each other because you and I are creation too. So I think, you know, if we could instill a sense of us being embedded within the creation and it taking care of us, and then us reciprocating that gift by doing our part to take care of it. I like that model a lot better than the traditional notion of Christian environmental stewardship. Sorry, that's a complete tangent. I'd be happy to talk more about that, or if anybody has questions, feel free to contact me. By the way, if you have questions about anything I talk about tonight, I would be more than happy to dialogue with you either by email or phone call. So don't ever hesitate to reach out and get in touch with me. So my title here is Ken-O-Sha, working for reconciliation in West Michigan Watershed. And you might be a little confused because I'm the director of Plaster Creek Stewards and I'm talking about Ken-O-Sha. What's going on here? Ken-O-Sha is the original Ottawa name for Plaster Creek. And Ken-O-Sha means water of the walleye. And Plaster Creek is a name that replaced Ken-O-Sha. And I'll tell you how that name change occurred as I get into the presentation here. So what I'd like to do is take you through just an introduction to Plaster Creek. What are the problems with this waterway? And to really understand how those problems came to be, we need to understand some of the history of Plaster Creek. And then I'll tell you about our group, Plaster Creek Stewards, and how we came to be and what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. And then that will lead us right into an emerging area of ecology that's being referred to as reconciliation ecology, which I think is a really nice place for where our work fits. And I'll show you some specific projects that we've taken. And then because you all are gardeners, and I know we're very like-minded, and it's also a very late spring, I want to show you some pretty pictures of plants that have worked really well for us in our restoration work. And then I'll close with a couple concluding thoughts. So I want to impress, this is probably something you're all aware of, but maybe you just don't realize it or just need to be reminded that we all live in a watershed someplace. We're right now existing in different places thanks to the amazing abilities of technology, but every place we are in is in a watershed someplace. And if you're in a rural watershed or an urban watershed, your watershed probably has issues, kind of like people, we all have issues. And I would just encourage you, if you don't already, get to know your watershed. A watershed is a really nice sort of tangible area that, that you can really do some good in. And so if there's a watershed group near you, find out what they're involved in and maybe where you can plug in and where you can lend some of your expertise with your knowledge of plants and gardening. This is contiguous 48 states split up into major watersheds. If you look just at the Great Lakes, I really like this map because each of the drainage areas for each Great Lakes is colored with a different primary color here. And then you can see some of the different shading to show some of the major watersheds. So the Great Lakes all drain out through the St. Lawrence Seaway, out to the Atlantic Ocean. And then we'll zero in a little closer. Here we are, the red rectangle there is Kent County. And the tie-dye looking image there is a digital elevation map of Kent County with the higher areas in the red tones and the lower areas in the blues. And so our waterways here are in the blues, and the thick blue line that you see snaking through Kent County is the Grand River, the largest river in the state of Michigan. And then Plaster Creek is right here. And so the area outlined in red, that's the drainage area for Plaster Creek, and which is what a watershed is. It's an area of land that all drains to a common point. And for Plaster Creek, the common point is where it connects to the Grand River. Right? And our watershed is about 58 square miles. Not super large. It starts out in rural areas and then it flows through suburban, commercial, and then into lower income urban neighborhoods, mostly communities of color, and through some industrial areas before it reaches the Grand River. As we've learned more about our watershed and about this creek, we've learned some about the history. And it's been good for us to be made aware that white, Black, Latino people are not the only people who've ever lived in this watershed, but this watershed was occupied by indigenous people for upwards of 10,000 years. And so as we've learned more about the indigenous people who have occupied this watershed and taken good care of it, we developed a land acknowledgement statement that I'd like to read with you now. This is a picture showing some of the mounds along the Grand River, and there were Hopewell mounds in the Plaster Creek watershed as well. Hopewell were there before the Ottawa moved in. But here's our land acknowledgement statement. The Plaster Creek watershed occupies a portion of the ancestral home of the Hopewell people of the Goodall Focus, and more recently, the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. We are grateful for the way these early inhabitants cared for the land and loved it. We are informed by their teachings, and we strive to honor their example through ongoing education and restoration work. It was somewhat of a wake-up call to us to realize that there were people who occupied this watershed for much, much longer than the European immigrants occupied this watershed. And they never had problems with E. coli, and they never had problems with with excess sediment and nutrient runoff and all these sorts of things. So the creek was used by people. It blessed people for many, many, many years before it started declining in health. And so we take hope from the fact that people lived in this watershed in the past and the creek stayed healthy. And we hope that we can return to some semblance of that kind of existence again. So what are these problems? I kind of mentioned them, a couple of them. The big one is it gets too much water when it rains and when the snow melts. It's because of all the impermeable surfaces that we have created by clearing the forests in West Michigan. So the flow dynamics are just really problematic. So I'll show you a picture in a moment. But when it rains heavy, it's like a flash flood coming down this creek because of all the roadways and rooftops, parking lots, etc. And that's a trigger for many other problems. So when there's high volumes of water moving through the creek, then we get elevated levels of lots of other things like sediment and like nutrients. So these are things that are coming in off the land surface whenever it rains. Thermal pollution as well, especially in the summers. We have some big mall parking lots and university parking lots like Calvin's parking lot. But when it warms up in the summer and then you get a late afternoon thunderstorm, that's not only a whole bunch of water coming into the creek, but it's really warm water that washes into the creek. And that real sudden change in temperature is extremely hard for aquatic organisms. Trash and lots of other toxic substances. We're still getting point source pollution in this creek. A lot of the point sources have been checked and are no longer, but it's still happening. And we're trying to identify those places. But also, you know, there's a negative feedback loop here because people know this is a really contaminated stream. And so they just dump stuff in it. They figure, you know, what's a little more trash. So this is a picture taken right near my home, right along the creek, where we frequently get calls from people saying there's a whole bunch of tires that somebody dumped here or a whole bunch of trash dumped here. So this negative feedback loop is a hard thing to break. And then finally, bacterial contamination as well. You don't see this, but the creek, especially when it's running with high volumes of water, carries very dangerous loads of bacteria. By the way, this picture is taken of some of my students who are collecting water samples from one of the two main tributaries to Plaster Creek. It's called Silver Creek. And it's emerging from that cement culvert there into Plaster Creek. And it has been underground for 4 miles. So 4 miles of this feeder stream into Plaster Creek is underground, sees no daylight whatsoever. So, and they're sampling the water there, and then they were sampling the water out in the main channel for comparison. So here it gives you an idea of flow dynamics. This is taken near the mouth of Plaster Creek, where about a mile upstream from where it joins the Grand River. And this was taken one afternoon when there were thunderstorms predicted for the night. And there was about a 1-inch rainfall that came with thunderstorms overnight. And I went back to the same spot the next day and took this picture. You can still see those Pepsi crates in the background. So from here to here. And you notice, I'm sure, not only the volume that changed, but the clarity. I mean, it's never really clear. So whatever is the opposite of clarity. But look at it, it looks like chocolate milk in this picture. It's carrying way too much sediment because of all the erosion, because it got too much water when it rained. Right. And then I want to show you the E. coli too. And we're really working hard to try to identify the sources, and we found some of them, but certainly not all. But in June 2, 2015, this is in the upper reaches of the watershed, a place called Paris Park. We collected water samples from the creek, the main channel of Plaster Creek. And then we took the water sample and we put it into a little medium and shook it up, and then we put it into a Petri dish. And then we cultured the Petri dish, put it in an incubator for 36 hours. And this is standard protocol. It's called ColaScan. And ColaScan, the medium is put together in such a way that when E. coli grows out of that water sample, it will grow into a purple colony. And so you can see some red colonies here, but there's, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a 5th E. coli colony up against the side of the Petri dish here. All right, so, if you take a known volume of water out of the creek, and then you quantify how many E. coli came from that known volume, then you can get a number of E. coli per 100 mils. And that's the standard that is used by the state to establish what's safe for partial body contact and full body contact. So this was a 2.5 milliliter sample, and we had 5 E. coli colonies. So if you do your math, it comes to 200 colonies per 100 mils. And the Michigan water quality standards set for full body contact, for safe full body contact, it says it has to be below 130 colonies per 100 mils. So at this point in time at Paris Park, E. coli was too high to be considered, have that water be considered safe for full body contact. So kids should not have been playing in that creek at that time. But truth be told, this is pretty clean for Plaster Creek. And we had thunderstorms come through, and we had lots of surface runoff. And with that comes all this stuff that I've been talking about. And so we went back on June 12 and resampled when the creek was much higher. And this is what the plate looked like, right? Each one of those little dots is an E. coli colony. Same volume, 2.5 milliliters of water. And this comes to 24,000 colonies per 100 mils. So this is way, way, way higher than what's considered safe, either for full body contact or for partial body contact. So at this point, nobody should touch this water, and pets shouldn't go into the stream. And if there's a raccoon who's trying to clean off some food there, this is not a good situation even for that raccoon. So this is a health hazard for people and for other animals, and very dangerous, actually, especially for communities downstream. As we've learned about some of these problems, it's really pulled at our heart, and we want to do something about it. And I will say, when we started, we really were focused on figuring out ways that we could clean up this creek. We figured that was our job. But the more we got into it, the more we realized that the polluted creek is really just a symptom. It's not the problem. Because if we were to clean up the creek and not do anything about the way people are living in the watershed, we would walk away from this suddenly clean creek. I was just laughing because there's no way we could do it so simply. But for the sake of argument, if we cleaned the creek up and walked away, figured we cleaned that creek and feel good about ourselves, if the behavior of the people in the watershed wasn't changed at all, then the creek is just going to get contaminated all over again. So we realized that the problem is broken relationships between people in the creek. And those broken relationships have emerged over time from a flawed worldview. People are not thinking about the creek the way they should. They're not understanding their own existence within this watershed in the way that they should. And so restoring the creek without addressing worldview assumptions that have allowed and even promoted this type of degradation will not have lasting impact. We realized that this creek was absolutely fine until European immigrants started showing up. And European immigrants brought with them an Enlightenment worldview. And one of those aspects was that people are somehow separate from nature. You have the natural world and you have the human world. And the natural world is there to serve us humans. I'm exaggerating to some degree, but you will probably recognize that, yeah, there's some truth in the way that a lot of people think about the world around us. We're more important, we're exceptional. And we can use the natural world however we want. We're the ones in charge, that kind of thing. So some of these worldview assumptions we think really need to be questioned and reconfigured and unlearned, if you will. But to really understand this flawed worldview and its assumptions, I want to spend a little more time talking about the history of Plaster Creek and how some of these problems became initiated. So, this is a really young creek. If you talk to people who do this kind of work in Alabama, I've got some friends who are doing stream restorations in Alabama. They're just shocked at how young our streams are here. We had glaciers removed from West Michigan, melting to the north about 15,000 years ago. And as those glaciers receded to the north, this open land was followed up by vegetation first, and then a lot of the Pleistocene mammals. And right on the heels of the Pleistocene mammals, there were native peoples who were moving through West Michigan, hunting the mammals and benefiting from the plants that were now growing in these new landscapes. All right. In what's called the Middle Woodland period, the group of people who came through here actually stayed, and they weren't just migrating through, but they lived here. They were more permanent residents, and these are known as the Hopewell. There were two main groups of mounds in West Michigan constructed by the Hopewell. One was called the Norton Mounds, and one was called the Converse Mounds. And the Converse Mounds were completely lost during the early construction of Grand Rapids. They were dug up, all the artifacts were taken, and some of those early immigrants made a lot of money by selling the artifacts to museums. The Converse Mounds were partially destroyed, but we still have them around, and you can still visit them if you know where to go. And so that's kind of neat that we still have these landforms created by the Hopewell way back around the turn of the century. I mean, way back around 0 BC, all right? The turn of the millennium, I guess that would be. The Hopewell people kind of mysteriously disappeared, and nobody exactly knows why or how. But around AD 800 is sort of the earliest suggested dates when the Ottawa showed up here in West Michigan. And these were part of the Anishinaabe, and they were a group of people moving from the east along the St. Lawrence Seaway. And some of their visionary leaders had been given this message that the people had to move to the east because there were going to be some new arrivals coming to their lands, and the new arrivals would threaten their way of life. And so they were moving to the east in advent of Europeans coming. And the visionaries were told, move the people to the west, along the St. Lawrence Seaway until you come to the place where food is growing on the water. And they didn't know what that meant, right? But they kept moving until they came into the Great Lakes states and they found wild rice. And they recognized that this is a food that's growing on the water, and they knew that this is the place for them to stop. And basically the Chippewa or the Ojibwe occupied the northern part of Michigan. The Ottawa were sort of the central part of the Lower Peninsula, and then the Potawatomi were northern Indiana, southern Michigan, and then kind of wrapped around the bottom of Lake Michigan into northern Illinois. Right. So in West Michigan, it was mostly the Ottawa. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash. So these were farmers. They created decorative pottery and baskets. They lived in large summer villages, and they called Plastic Creek Ken-O-Sha because they took fish out of this creek, and walleye came up into this creek to spawn. I just want to add too, these are just master craftsmen. They made birch bark canoes, and they navigated the Great Lakes. They were oftentimes moving goods between the Ojibwe in the north and the Potawatomi in the south. And one of the references I came across said that the Ottawa were the only people who were completely comfortable in a small canoe in the middle of the Great Lakes when they could see no shoreline on either direction. But they still knew where they were, and that gave them no pause. I would freak out. I could not handle that. Here's our early depiction of Grand Rapids, all right? The first settlements in Grand Rapids were 1826, and it was a mission that was set up. And the mission is depicted on the far side of the Grand River. In the back of this photograph, there's some buildings back there. And that area back there is called the Mission Lands. The original mission was a Baptist mission. By the way, Grand Rapids had been occupied for centuries by the Ottawa. It was a big gathering place because there were rapids here, and people would portage around the rapids, and it was a great place for meeting. It's also a really great place for fishing. And so this was a hub of Ottawa culture and interaction. It wasn't just Ottawa. The Shawnee would come up here, the Ojibwe, of course, and the Potawatomi, but lots of people were gathering here for centuries. And so the mission was set up here because there were so many potential converts, right? So missions never got set up in obscure areas. They were drawn to where Indigenous people already were living. In the near side of the Grand River that you see in the background there, there's 3 other buildings, and those were built in 1827 by Louis Campaw. And that's a blacksmith shop and a trading post, and then Louis' house. So there were 3 houses or buildings on this side, and then the mission buildings on the far side. And you can see the existence of some Indigenous people here with some teepees, and then the boats. And on the left there is a depiction of a wild plum orchard. So it was known that the Ottawa cultivated Prunus americana, the wild plum. And they had orchards of the wild plum along with their farms. All right. There's a story I want to tell you here that talks about these contrasting worldviews, and really sets up. I mean, when we first heard it, we just found this to be such a compelling story for the work of trying to restore Plaster Creek. So the story goes like this: that one of the chiefs in the area, and he oversaw much of the land that now we recognize as part of the Plaster Creek watershed. His name was Chief Blackbird. And because of some earlier interactions he'd had with some of the early traders, Chief Blackbird was very distrustful of white people. And he had good reasons. I won't go into those stories, but they are recorded. And I could reference them to you if you're interested. Anyway, he had good reason to be suspicious because of the way he had been treated by some of the early traders, some of the early white people that showed up in Michigan. And he was not excited about the missionaries being there and trying to convert his people. And the story that we came across that we found so compelling was written by a guy named Charles Belknap. We have Belknap Park here in Grand Rapids that's named after Charles Belknap. He's one of the first mayors of Grand Rapids, and he and his family moved to Grand Rapids in the late 1840s, early 1850s. And Belknap recorded this story just the year before he died in 1927. And he starts out by saying that this is a story that his father told him from some of the other settler families in the area. They knew all about this story. So, and the story is that Blackbird and the main missionary from the Baptist mission had this ongoing debate because Chief Blackbird said, I don't want my people going to your church. I don't want them to be converted. And he said, I've got two main reasons why I don't want that to happen. One is, you're telling us that in order to worship God, we need to go inside of a building. And I don't believe that. We encountered the Great Spirit outdoors, and there's no better place to encounter the Great Spirit. And he said, the second thing is, I don't understand why you need to read about your God in a book. The Ottawa did not have written language, and they learned from experiences, and they learned from stories, and they learned from teaching one another. And so the whole idea of learning from a book was completely foreign to him. And so for those reasons, he didn't want his people to be involved with this mission. And then the story goes on and says at one point, Chief Blackbird brought one of the missionary into his canoe. And then they paddled down the Grand River about a mile to where Ken-O-Sha flowed into the Grand River. And then they took a left and they went up Ken-O-Sha to where this creek overflowed into the Grand River floodplain. And there was a waterfall there, and it was facing west. And when the sun would start to go down in the late afternoon and it would hit that waterfall, it really lit up the waterfall because the waterfall was cascading over some very interesting rock outcrops that had kind of an orangish color to them. And the whole scene, Belknap describes, was just like the lights went on. And Chief Blackbird told the missionary, this is where we encounter the Great Spirit. This is a sacred space for my people. And the missionary was very interested in this spot, and especially in this orange colored rock, and he took a sample of it. And Belknap goes on to say that the sample was sent off to Detroit for analysis. And the word came back that this was very high quality gypsum. And gypsum at that time was known as a very highly marketable product because it would get ground up and it was used for fertilizer on farm fields. And it was also then mixed with water and could be used as plaster for building some of these more permanent building structures. So the first gypsum mine, and we've had many in Grand Rapids, was set up at that sacred spot along Plaster Creek, where the waterfall flowed over into the Grand River floodplain. And the creek was diverted, and the power from the creek was used to run grinding mills. And there was a huge mine that was set up there. So the name of Plaster Creek was shifted from Ken-O-Sha to Plaster. And as we have thought a lot about this, this contrast in worldviews and this contrast in what you value and how you value it, it has occurred to us that this was a very significant moment in the history of this creek, and that the name change of this waterway from Ken-O-Sha to Plaster Creek reveals this significant worldview shift that was taking place in the mid-1800s. So Ken-O-Sha identifies the creek by a living creature that resided within it. Plaster Creek identifies this water by a non-living resource that was mined from its banks. Ken-O-Sha provided food, while Plaster Creek provided wealth, at least for a time. There's no plaster mine there now. There's no gypsum mine there. It's just a really, really devastated landscape. Ken-O-Sha included a sacred space for worship, while Plaster Creek became a sewage and garbage conduit. Ken-O-Sha was life-giving, and today Plaster Creek is life-threatening. When we came across this story, I mean, it just grabbed at us, especially being part of Calvin University, a faith-based college, us being Christians, and realizing that people of faith, of Christian faith, were involved in the degradation of this creek from the start. It only seemed appropriate that people of faith ought to be involved in the restoration of this creek as well. So it's provided a lot of powerful motivation for us and for our work. So that was the first gypsum mine. 1841 is when it was set up. In the peak production, the late 1890s, there were 13 different gypsum mines in the downtown Grand Rapids area. That waterfall was destroyed, the creek was rerouted and channelized. One citation I found, 1905, said that gypsum contributed inexhaustible wealth to the city of Grand Rapids. All right, so by the year 2000, it wasn't just gypsum mining, there was all sorts of other things happening, but by the year 2000, Plaster Creek had become known as the most contaminated waterway in West Michigan due to high levels of sediment and bacteria and extreme peak flows. I came to Calvin in 1997, and I got roped in with some colleagues of mine, faculty at Calvin, who were really working on service learning projects, and service learning sounded like an exciting thing for me to have my students do. I'm a botanist. So we were talking a lot about sort of this gaining awareness that we're in the Plaster Creek watershed, Calvin University is, and we need to learn more about this watershed and some of the problems associated with it. And so one of my first projects is I had my plant taxonomy students do a botanical inventory of the natural areas that were still along Plaster Creek. And I started getting to know Plaster Creek from all these visits and started to actually visibly see the contamination that was there. And we kept doing these service learning projects until about the year 2009, when we started this organization, Plaster Creek Stewards. This little history I've shared with you, I want to summarize here. So Plaster Creek emerged about 15,000 years ago from melting glaciers, and it was a thriving waterway until a downward spiral in environmental health began about 150 years ago. On an annual scale, this creek was fine until noon on December 27. Another way to think of it is that for 99% of its existence, Plaster Creek was life-supporting, and today it's life-threatening. The fact that we messed it up in such a short period of time also gives me hope that maybe we can fix it in a relatively short period of time too. So our service learning projects sort of came together, and we became convinced we've got to get more serious about this, especially because at Calvin, we talk a lot about stewardship, environmental stewardship as a Christian calling. And yet we're living in a watershed that is drained by a creek that's known as the most contaminated waterway in West Michigan. And that made a lot of us really uneasy because it didn't seem like our walk was matching our talk. And so we got together with some pastors, some local pastors, a lot of students, and some local nonprofit, people working in local nonprofits. And we had a big powwow in the summer of 2009, 3-day workshop, basically just asking one another, what should we do? What can we do? And it was decided Calvin should form a watershed group. And then out of that meeting came this name, Plaster Creek Stewards. And we were all excited, and we decided, let's write some grant proposals, and we'll get some money, and we'll grow this organization. And our first 9 grant proposals were denied, one after the other. And some of them looked so hopeful. It seemed like what we wanted to do fit them so well. And in retrospect, a faith-based watershed group that hasn't done any work before is asking us for money. You know, it's kind of like, of course, you're not going to give money to a group like that. Christians have not been on the forefront of any sort of environmental campaigns. And so in retrospect, we understand. But our 10th attempt was for an EPA grant, and we got it. They took a chance with us. It was a $54,000 capacity or organizational capacity building grant. And we were so excited. And since then, I mean, the grant world works in the opposite way too. If you get a grant and you do what you say you're going to do and you do it well, and you're a really good client and you keep your books, word gets around. And so since then, we've been very successful at getting subsequent grants. To date, we're over $4 million in grants that we've gotten over the past decade. And I will say our focus now, I mentioned earlier, our focus at the start was to clean up a creek, and that's not our focus right now. Our focus now is to involve people and give them a chance to become involved in cleaning up a creek. And as we do that, we're trying to build a relationship, a healthy relationship between people and this creek again. Help the people to recognize some of the things they're doing in their yard that might be damaging to this creek, and some new ways that they could do things in their yard or at their business or at their house of worship or at the school where their kids go. And so we provide opportunities for people to get involved and to start caring about the creek again. These pictures too remind me to tell you that we have 3 foci of what we do, and mostly because we're housed in a university, but we do educational events, as you can see with the picture on the top right and then the picture on the bottom right. We hold community events like that, and they're really exciting times because you get people of all ages and all backgrounds. And what that does too is it brings people from lower down in the watershed, and they meet people who live up higher in the watershed. And so we're getting watershed residents together, and they find out where they live, and they talk about what the creek looks like by them. And we're starting to heal relationships between people, or even just establish relationships between people in the watershed too. The middle picture is a former student of mine, Nate, who's collecting some water samples there. So we also do research. And the picture on the left is a big restoration project. So we do on the ground restoration. So education, research, and on the ground restoration. Who are we? Plaster Creek Stewards. This is us. Julie Wiltscott and I are 2 faculty members. I'm in the biology department, and Julie is a civil and environmental engineer in our engineering department. And at Calvin, like many universities, faculty are expected to do research. So Julie has dedicated her focus on research on the Plaster Creek watershed. And that's my focus as well as a biologist, as a botanist. So we're 2 faculty. And then Andrea Luberts and Deanna Gilhood are full-time with Plaster Creek Stewards. Project manager is Andrea, and then the coordinator is Deanna. So Deanna is sort of a boots on the ground person, and Andrea helps us track our grants and does all our grant reporting and lines up volunteers. And both of them are amazing people. Araceli and Anna. Araceli is an assistant to Andrea. Anna is an assistant to Deanna. And we just hired Benji as our greenhouse manager. So he grows native plants for our various projects. And every summer, because of a lot of grant money that we get, we're able to hire a team of students. And this was our team from last summer. And you can see I'm in there, and my wife is in there, and Deanna and Andrea, so our staff and the students are in there together. But we had about 15 different students, and they're from a wide variety of disciplines. Problems that we encounter in the watershed are multidisciplinary problems. So we've got engineers in here, we've got environmental education major, we've got an art major, we've got biologists, environmental scientists, a chemist, pre-med student who's in here who's very interested in public health. And so it's a really diverse group of students, but they all really care a lot about sustainability and about environmental care. And we really work hard to foster a sense of community too. This, I should mention, this is not how they come to work in the morning. This was one of our social events at Andrea's house, and she lives on a small pond in Jenison. So we had a really nice potluck that night, and everybody went swimming. All right, our work. Our work, we feel, situates itself really nicely in this area of ecology that's emerging called reconciliation ecology. It was first introduced by Michael Rosenzweig, who's at University of Arizona, and he wrote a book called Win-Win Ecology. This is back in 2003, and he introduced the term reconciliation ecology. And his point here is that, you know, if you look at across the planet, about 95% of the land surface is dominated by human beings. About 5% of the land in total is set aside, protected for species that are not Homo sapiens. And his point is, if we're concerned about species loss, habitat degradation, we don't need to do a better job with the 5%, right? We need to protect the 5% for sure. But what we really need to work on is that 95%. Can we alter the human dominated landscapes in such a way that biodiversity comes back and joins us in these human dominated areas? So can we redo cities? Can we redo agriculture? Can we redo industrial parks in ways that they become much more friendly to other elements of biodiversity besides just human beings? And he refers to this whole practice as reconciliation ecology. The way we understand reconciliation ecology is that it's a reinventing of the human presence to better accommodate, affirm, and fit into the landscape of biodiversity which surrounds us. We understand reconciliation ecology to be the science of restoring, creating, and maintaining habitats and conserving biodiversity in the places where people live, work, or play. So it requires recognizing the problem, acknowledging our complicity in the problem, and then making a commitment to right the wrongs that have been done in the past, and then live into a more hopeful future with changed behaviors. So we need to reimagine and reconfigure that human creation relationship, as well as the human-human relationship. As I mentioned at the start, we're part of creation too. And what we're finding is, as we're introducing houses of worship in the upper part of the watershed to houses of worship in the lower part, schools, we do reciprocal visits with kids, and they meet kids up in the rural parts, and they go down and meet kids in the urban parts, and they get to know them. Then suddenly downstream is not just this ambiguous area, but it has a face and a name. And you've gotten to know somebody who lives downstream, and that makes you think twice about the way you interact with the stream in the upper parts of the watershed. So just getting people together changes things too. This is one of the pictures of some of the plants that we've grown. I just love those roots there. That picture always fills me with so much hope. Those roots just want to get out and do a whole bunch of good work. So here are a couple other slides before I get into some of the projects. But Plaster Creek Stewards, we help residents develop a new relationship with their watershed and with each other. We provide opportunities to foster a transition away from neglect and apathy towards tending and keeping. Just earlier this week, we're doing a big floodplain restoration in the upper part of the watershed. We had 200 elementary school kids out to our floodplain restoration project. Not the most efficient way to plant a floodplain, but the kids, they come out there and they learn about the problems of the creek, and they learn how this floodplain restoration is going to help the creek. It's going to help make the water cleaner, and they sure do have a lot of energy. So all of our projects, we try to get as many people out to help us do the work as possible, because that's restoring the relationships. So we grow a lot of plants for our projects. Here are some pictures from our greenhouse. These are all native plants from seeds we collect locally. We have a native tree nursery where we're growing up a lot of oaks. I'm just really taken by oaks, and some of the stuff Doug Talamy has written about oaks. And so I'm trying to make this oak-rich watershed as much as I can. Some of the other flats that we're growing up. We do a lot of bulrushes and sedges and rushes, because those things oftentimes grow alongside of streams and waterways, and they have amazing root systems that really do a good job holding the soil. So I'm going to show you a couple projects here, and I'll talk a little bit about research, and then I'll end with highlighting some of the plants that have worked really well for us. So this is just a project on campus. We call this the campus bioswale, or preserve house bioswale. This is one of the first projects we did. There's an area on campus that was it was all lawn, and it was an area of lawn that sometimes the mowers wouldn't dare go into because it'd be really wet, because it's sort of draining a slope. And sometimes they would go in there and they get their mower stuck. And so we recognized this, and we took out a whole bunch of lawn, and then we reconfigured it. We channeled the water through the middle, and we created some check dams with just some cobbles. And so then we're holding the water back with these little check dams. And then the water can percolate down into the soil instead of just running off the soil. This area isn't going to have to be mowed or blowed or fertilized. So we're not expending carbon in taking care of this. In fact, we planted it all full of native plants, and now it's a carbon sponge. It's absorbing carbon. And all those roots from those wetland plants are making it hard for the water to just run through it. They're taking up a lot of that water. So the water that does make it through this bioswale and heading off towards Plaster Creek is much lower volume. And by the time it gets to this little culvert at the bottom of the picture, it's a lot cleaner than it was when this was a lawn. So, and we get all sorts of biodiversity benefits here because this is a hotbed for all kinds of insects. And because it attracts insects, it also attracts lots of birds. This is a project in the city of Grand Rapids off of our campus. And I first got an idea of this up in Grayling, Michigan, where Trout Unlimited did a bunch of these to protect the Au Sable River. And so I came back from visiting Grayling with the idea of, boy, what if we did this in the Plaster Creek watershed? And so what this is creating what are called curb cut rain gardens. So we take the area between the sidewalk and the street, and we remove the soil, the lawn, and then we work with a local excavator who digs it out. And we create a little a rock channel, and then a rock basin. So the water that starts coming down the street, headed for a storm drain, which will take it to the nearest waterway, eventually to Plaster Creek, gets diverted because there's a cut in the curb there. And then it goes into the rock channel like a little stream bed. And then it spreads out into that basin where we filled it with native plants. So we work closely with the city of Grand Rapids utilities to make sure that we're not putting these over top of some important utility lines. So we get all these locations checked out. We also work in cooperation with the homeowners, and they have to sign a contract that they'll take care of the garden. And they also are invited to choose which plants they want to put in there. So we give them a palette of different species. And so here's another picture of some rain gardens with some students out checking it out. And this is a map. We prepare a map for the homeowner, and then we show them which plants were planted where. This has been a really popular program. Probably the cost, if you were to just pay up front, the cost for a garden from the excavation to all the planting would be about $1,500, but we've been able to get grants to support this, so the homeowners get them for free as long as they agree to take care of them. And we're up over 115 of these now in Southeast Grand Rapids. We also have a partnership with National Wildlife Federation. They have a program called Sacred Grounds where they try to do native gardens on the campuses of houses of worship. And so this was started in 2018, our partnership with them. And we to date have 19 different projects at various houses of worship. We had been doing this before, and that was actually one thing that attracted National Wildlife Federation to us to form this partnership. So we in total have projects already installed at over 30 houses of worship. And we have 8 more slated for this coming summer. Some of these are rain gardens, some of these are just pollinator gardens. The one in the middle there is at a mosque, and we've had a really nice partnership with a local mosque. And that's a wonderful way of bringing different people together to work on a common project because they all care for the creek. And then the last project I want to show you is the project we did at Dutton Shadyside Park. This was a floodplain restoration project we started in 2018. And this was the largest project we did until the one that we're doing this coming summer. This is a creek that had extreme fluctuations in flow, and the lawn was right down to the edge of the creek. So this is Plaster Creek coming through here. But you can see these banks 5 to 6 feet of drop, and lawn just is lousy at holding soil, especially when you get those fluctuations in flow. So what do you do with a situation like that? Well, the textbook way to approach this is to peel back the banks, those steep banks, and make it so that that creek will overflow more frequently when it starts to rise. And then when it overflows more frequently, you plant that area that it's overflowing into with floodplain vegetation. And the vegetation will slow that water down and it will soak it up. And when it slows down, it drops out sediment like a floodplain is supposed to do. And so this was 2019, the work. And here come in a bunch of floodplain plants that we grew in our greenhouses. And with a number of big work days, we sunk in over 70,000 plants into this project. And in 2020, this is what we had. We had a nice floodplain. We have a creek that's not nearly as volatile. The floodplain vegetation slows the water down when it overflows, and way more insects than when this was all lawn, and way more birds. We also put in over 200 trees up on the shoulder of the floodplain. Some of the wetland vegetation that we put in there is a green bulrush here. The other ones are a couple of species of carex. In 2021, just last summer, I visited this site after we had, I think, over 6 inches of rain in about 4 days. And I was amazed. The floodplain had really been beaten down because it had been really overflowed. And a whole bunch of sediment had fallen out. You can see that on the left there. Look at all that sediment that's in the floodplain. But look at the main channel. There's gravel bars there. And that's the sign of a healthy creek when you have gravel. So it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's taking the sediment out of the creek and it's putting it into the floodplain. And that floodplain vegetation that looks so beat up. Before I get to that, when we were looking at this, swimming up the gravel bar was this water snake hunting for macroinvertebrates, which like to live in those gravel bars. So that was so exciting to see the way that nature has responded back. But here it is, October 2021, and you can't really tell that we had that massive sort of floodplain deposition event. The fall colors are coming on, and it's looking great again. So it's been a really satisfying project. I'll also mention that we do a high school green team every summer. So like this picture on the bottom left there, I mean, these are kids from the watershed. Some of them live upstream in their rural farming communities. Some of them are downstream in their urban. And they come together for a 3-week session and they learn about the watershed. And they're mentored by college students who care about the watershed. And this has been a really wonderful program. So we do 2 3-week sessions every summer. And we also give these young people some training in ecology and in gardening and greenhouse maintenance and that sort of thing. So they're learning some job skills along the way. Been a really exciting program. So there's been a lot of research projects done. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of them here as I finish up. But some engineering projects. We did an oral history project, interviewed over 85 mostly senior citizens to tell us their memories of the creek and the watershed. Chemistry, of course, microbiology, and biology. So I want to tell you quickly about floodplain curb cut rain garden research. So these are all native plants. And one question we had is which native plants are going to do best in these very novel habitats, right? These are not anything close to natural. And they're getting road runoff in the winter, so they're getting salt and they're getting grit. And so we're really interested to know which native plants are going to do best. And so we did a study of several of these back in 2015. And we generated some data. On the left-hand axis, there's survivorship. And on the bottom is performance. So survivorship is how many of the ones we planted survived. One would be 100%. And then performance is just not only did they survive, but how do they look, you know? And a 10 means they look fantastic. And, you know, a 1 means it survived, but barely. And so we combine survivorship and performance into a grid like this, and then we can see which ones are good at surviving and performing. And those are in the upper right-hand quadrant. And the bottom left-hand quadrant are ones that are relatively low in survivorship and performance, and those may need some extra help. But this kind of thing is helping us understand which particular species are doing well in these urban curb cut rain gardens. If you want a reference, send me an email and I can send you a PDF of the paper that we published these data in. We're also really interested in transpiration. So in these curb cut rain gardens, we not only want the plants to do well, but we want them to soak up a lot of stormwater runoff and pump it into the air. And with this little machine here, this handheld barometer, we can measure the rate of transpiration, how fast is water leaving the leaves. And so it's a really powerful tool. And it's been really interesting. I know this is really small. The different lines represent different species. And these are 3 different years where we're collecting transpiration data. And on the bottom x-axis is just it's a timeline, right? So it goes through the season. And one thing I just want you to notice is there's a purple line that's on the top of all 3 of these, or at least near the top of all 3 of these. And there's a red line that's near the bottom of all 3 of these. The best plant for transpiring water from the soil to the air is butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. it's way better than a lot of the other ones, and consistently better. So it's moving a lot of water out. And the worst one is Allium cernunum, the nodding wild onion, which surprised me at first. But as I thought about it, it's making a bulb and it's storing water. So it's probably not so quick to let water just transpire through its leaves, but it's trying to save water and help it through drier times. So in retrospect, that made a certain amount of sense. So this is also giving us an idea of which are good plants to use that we can combine with the performance and survival data as we choose plants for these urban locations. I won't show you any data from this study because we just set it up in 2020, but we planted 220 trees along a section of Plaster Creek called Schooley Drain. This is way in the upper reaches of the watershed, just a straight channel, and it's full of reed canary grass. And we planted, this is a joint project with the Kent County Drain Commission. We planted white oak, bur oak, tulip poplar, sugar maple, and hackberry and sycamore along here. We planted them in clusters, and we want to know a couple things. One is which of these tree species is best at transpiring water. So kind of like the previous study I just showed you. And also this channel is choked out with reed canary grass and invasive grass. So we also want to know which species is best at shading out or at least discouraging reed canary grass. So here's another picture of, now these are the trees there, and after reed canary grass has grown back, it's so thick, but the trees have done well. And so these are data we'll be collecting probably at least for the next 5 years on this very long linear experiment with these 220 trees. All right, so I'll finish off with just showing you some of the pictures of some of the plants that have worked really well for us. Oaks, swamp white oak, chestnut oak, and bur oaks are all really, really good trees to use. And they have a historical presence here. And they are wonderful hosts for all kinds of insects. There's a great website that I've given you here, and you can just plug in your zip code, and it gives you a ranking of native species in terms of which ones are most important for lepidopteran hosts, to be lepidopteran hosts, moths or butterflies. So which species are the best ones in your area code that moths and butterflies will lay their eggs on. So it's a really wonderful website. And oaks come out in our 49507 zip code as the best tree to plant for moths and butterflies. We like the silphiums and helianthuses, amazing root systems. Great plants for bees when they're in flower, and then they're like living bird feeders when they make their fruits or seeds. And these are really tall plants, so they kind of act like canopy emergence, if you will, adding another layer of diversity. Rattlesnake master is a wonderful plant in urban spaces. It's done really, really well. And I think it adds a really different texture to a garden because it has leaves that look kind of like yuccas. And then those seed heads in the fall are great for birds. And mud dauber wasps, those black wasps, will come in when it's in flower and hit on these flowers. We really like the lobelias as well. Super wet spots, the cardinal flower, and then great blue lobelia actually tolerates dry areas quite well. So, and the cardinal flowers, of course, are great sources of nectar for hummingbirds, and they flower right about the time hummingbirds are tanking up, ready to leave on their migration to the south. Columbine actually flowers when the hummingbirds come back, and they provide nourishment for the hummingbirds after their long flight. So this is another really important one to use. Not as much a long-term perennial, but it spreads by seeds when it's in a happy place. Wild bergamot is a really good one. I've seen hummingbirds on these as well as lots of different bees. Great color, and it tolerates lots of different moisture conditions, as does the blue flag iris. And these flowers are so pretty. And again, the leaves look very different than a lot of our other forbs because they're monocots. So they add another different texture. The milkweeds are great. Swamp milkweed. I found monarchs seem to prefer this even over common milkweed. So if you've got a moist area, this is a beautiful one to plant. And they can tolerate dry conditions once they're established. Here's that butterfly weed I was telling you about earlier. Hard to get much more beautiful than that orange color from the butterfly weed. And these guys like it a lot drier, as many of you know. and they aren't very tall. The blazing stars are great. Liatris aspera and Scariosa both like it dry. Spicata likes it wet, but once established, it can tolerate some drying out. If you can get your hands on some Liatris cylindracea, that is a real short one. Really beautiful, smaller plant. Great for bees and butterflies. And I like sedges so much. A lot of these are evergreen. They're not showy. They're not insect pollinated, so they don't have the bright colors. But they form really nice clumps. And like I said, many of them are evergreen. And I've given you a list here of some of the ones that work really well for us in some of our urban plantings. So my summary, everyone lives in a watershed. So get to know your watershed if you don't know very much about it already. And Plaster Creek Stewards is working to reintroduce residents to their watershed and to their fellow watershed residents. We have found that caring for the land and caring for each other goes together in reconciliation ecology, getting to know your neighbor, getting to know your downstream neighbor. And urban spaces can draw back native biodiversity. We have seen it over and over again. You put the right plants in and the native pollinators show up and the native seed eaters, they show up. So we can do this. People don't have to impose themselves onto the creation. We can relearn to fit into creation better. We're capable of that. We're fully capable of it. And then my last slide, a Wendell Berry quote that we like a lot. Do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you. All right, thank you very much. Those are my comments. So let me stop sharing my screen here.
Dave, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I'm not seeing any questions. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question, and it
Great.
has to deal with some of the metrics you've been presenting, just to get a feel. I had the 70,000 plants in that one section of stream there. About how much length of stream or area, something that would give us an idea of what that filled in.
Yeah, so that stream that runs through Shadyside Park there, if you were to trace that channel, it's about a 1/4 mile length of stream.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. And I would think the acreage of that restoration was probably, I think it's 6 or 7 acres.
Okay. So pretty reasonable size.
Yeah, it's a pretty good size.
Yeah. So out of that, just to keep that on that same thread there, the 70,000 plants covers that much area. How much do you feel you have to cover to really create an impact? And
Thanks, Norm.
That's a tough number.
Yeah, that when you do work like this, there are days when you think, man, we're making good progress, and then there's days when you think there's no way we're going to ever do, anything that's measurable. But we had an engineering study done where they looked at those curb cut rain gardens. Mm-hmm. They're looking at the volume of water that those curb cut rain gardens can capture with a rain event, and they did some modeling, and we looked at 1 2-acre section where we put in a lot of curb cut rain gardens, and they modeled if that area was a forest, which it was before pre-settlement times, right? A 2-inch rainfall in that 2-acre area, they calculated what the volume of water would be that would make it into Plaster Creek under natural conditions. Mm-hmm. And then they modeled with all the houses that are currently there and all the impermeable surfaces, they modeled how much water now today gets into Plaster Creek. And then looking at those 2 volumes, which were quite different, they asked the question, how many curb cut rain gardens would we need in order to get the volume of water back down to pre-settlement levels? And the number they came up with was 1 curb cut rain garden in every 8 houses. Okay. So it's not like everybody has to have a curb cut rain garden.
Exactly. That's a doable thing. So that's encouraging.
When they came up with those numbers, it was really encouraging to us.
Yeah.
So when we moved into another neighborhood with that project, we prepared a little video for people to watch, and we called it Be 1 in 8. And then we explained that whole concept. And you have a chance to be one of those 1 in 8s in your neighborhood. And so that project has been really successful. And we have a long list of people who want a curb cut rain garden.
Oh, those are a very good idea. We see some around in our neighborhood, but certainly not as many as there could be.
Yeah,
And there's no question you have to mitigate the runoff.
right.
And there's different ways to do that, but that's a beautiful way to do it. So that solves a whole bunch of problems. So I
Yeah.
like that.
Thanks a lot.
Well, I'd like to mention that we have a dedicated native plant page on the Michigan Master Gardener Association website, which can be found at michiganmastergardener.org. I will be adding some more information. I'm toying with the idea of just doing a Watershed additional page with information. And Dave, now I'm going to be emailing you to get some of your stats and stuff to add
Sure.
to our pages.
Sure.
We have a lot of information about events, including native plant sales on our calendars. So I encourage all of you to check those out. I have other information that will be coming out in the next webinar newsletter, but I want to mention that Kelvin is hosting a native plant sale on May 14th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And you can either pre-order or you can also stop by. For those of you in the Grand Rapids area and you haven't seen their native plant area, you need to check out their gardens. It was redone, what, 3
years ago.
3 years
Yeah.
ago.
Mhm.
It's just beautiful.
Mhm.
It's beautiful. I also found that Rochester Hills is having an online sale with Clinton River Watershed Council on June 5th through June 9th. We'll get that on the calendar if it's not. And then I found Harrison Nature Center native plant sale. That's out of Okemos, pre-orders by April 29th. And if you're looking for native plant sales, we have, I don't know if it's 10 or 11 now, wild ones in the state of Michigan. So I'm going to put the information for that. But if you look up Google wild ones for state of Michigan, it'll tell you where all the chapters are, and then go to those. And I'm pretty sure each one does a native plant sale, and they always have really good native plant sales. And then we have a list of native plant suppliers already on the website.
Dave, thank you for those metrics on what the survivable plants are. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's giving you your bang for your buck. So
Yeah, and there are wonderful opportunities to do research because not a lot of people have done this kind of thing before. So it's kind of fun.
Yep.
Mhm.
Well, I still don't see any questions. So I'd like to, Dave, thank you again for your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you for those of you who have joined us. And I think we're going to say good night.
Okay.
Thank you
Bye,
very much.
everyone. All right. Thanks a lot.
Bye, Dave.